This video has been made with the purpose of education and awareness of real crimes, and there is no disrespect intended to anyone. This is to help promote truth and justice for anyone who has been a victim of crime. What I'm about to report is what I have researched online, and I will welcome any corrections should they be required. Hello there, little Berry True Crime fans. Eri Berry here. Great to have you back on another video. For this one, we're going to be going to, similar to where we were before, to Australia this time, and we're going to go back in time right down to the 40s and the 50s. Caroline Mickelson was born in around 1890 in Balmain, Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. She had some siblings, but I don't know much about her childhood life, about what her life was like. All I found was that her parents were George and Mary Mickelson, and George was a labourer. They had quite a comfortable upbringing. They were able to purchase a home in a nice suburban area called Gladesville, and when Caroline was quite young, her mother died, and her father remarried a woman called Christine. When she was around 18 years old, with her father's consent, Caroline married Richard William Grills, who was also a labourer. They went on to have 6 children. They had 5 sons and 1 daughter, but one of their sons, whose name was Harold, he worked as a lifesaver or a lifeguard at a beach. He was pulling a deceased person from the water. This person had been in the water for some time, and it was speculated that he had contracted typhoid from this body, and 10 weeks later, unfortunately, he passed away, and the Grills also lost another one of their sons. How and how old, I'm not quite sure, but they had 4 surviving children, 3 sons and a daughter. Post-Second World War in Sydney, Australia was very, very difficult. More and more people were coming into the city, and this is what Australia needed. They needed skilled people to work. They had jobs for people, but it meant a high concentration density in that one particular area. And people were living in slums and in poverty, in tin houses. They could barely afford the repairs to their homes. But because of these poor living conditions, the city was not just overrun with people, it was overrun with rats. People were being bitten left, right and centre. Kids had to sleep sort of encased in blankets and between their parents so that they wouldn't get bit. They would be bit on their face, on their feet as they slept. Bubonic plague was rampant. Typhoid was rampant. Rats carry a lot of diseases, and they are unfortunately very, very hard to get rid of. Rat poisons were being sold in pretty much every single shop. You could get it at the corner shop, like you can go to the, just to the corner shop now and buy paracetamol. It was literally millions of people and millions of rats. Richard Grills, Caroline's husband, as I said, was a labourer, and he wasn't particularly well off. Money was very, very tight. Caroline was a full-time housewife and mother. They moved from apartment to apartment. They lived in a place called Redfern in Sydney. It was just kind of not nomadic exactly, but they didn't have a lot of time to settle down in a particular area until Richard, when he was around in his 40s or 50s, got a job as a real estate agent. The problem was there was a shortage of housing, so real estate was not too lucrative back then. It did give them a bit more stability, but it wasn't enough for Caroline. She didn't like the whole apartment living, and she absolutely hated and despised the rats, as well as the seemingly losing battle against them. When the couple were in their 50s, their 4 surviving children had grown up, and some had started families of their own. In her late 50s, Caroline, as I said, was becoming very disenfranchised with living in these high-rise apartments in the rat-infested city. She longed to move to the suburbs. That's where a lot of people were aiming to be well off in the affluent areas, and her father and stepmother lived in a place called Gladesville. Caroline was a passionate and avid baker. She made cakes, puddings, jams, preserves, biscuits for her friends and her family, providing these lovely treats whenever she visited them or when they visited her. She served tea while they played card games and played parlour games. Caroline was described as rather short and stout. She wore very large glasses and came across as very motherly, and some have described her as almost matron-like. And her family, even if they weren't her nieces and nephews, began to call her Auntie Carrie. After her father's death, and it was unclear when this exactly happened, I've seen conflicting reports, Caroline had actually inherited his house in Gladesville. So she was saying, okay, I've got a house in Gladesville. But there was one snag. The snag was that her stepmother be allowed to continue living there until her death, and then Caroline and her family can take the house. Christine Mickelson, Caroline's stepmother, was in her late 80s, but she was very healthy. In around 1947, Caroline began to spend more time with her stepmother, bringing her cakes and treats. I mean, she was a widow, so of course she would need people around all the time. And how did Caroline show her love? Cakes, treats, puddings, jams, and tea. Soon, the once healthy Christine started to become very weak. Her hair began to fall out. Her legs would buckle under her. She would complain of tingling, of pain. She would vomit, pass out, and she began to lose her sight. Caroline continued to care for her stepmother, feeding her, cleaning for her, spending a lot of time in the house, doing what people believed was nursing Christine back to health. Unfortunately, Christine's condition deteriorated quite quickly over a few weeks, and she passed away, leaving Caroline and Richard free to move into the lovely suburban home in Gladesville. Caroline Grills finally had the affluent house in the suburbs that she always wanted. In January 1948, Richard's sister-in-law, Angelina Thomas, passed away at the age of 84, and the Grills found out that she had left Richard her house in her will in a place called Lura, I believe it's pronounced, in Sydney. So the once struggling Grills had 2 homes, so they were doing pretty well. Over the next few years, the Grills continued to spend time with their extending families, bringing them cakes and biscuits and ginger preserves, and of course they fondly called her Auntie Carrie, so whether or not she was an aunt. A few more deaths to the family followed, so there was Caroline's 60-year-old sister-in-law Mary Mickelson, so obviously married to one of Caroline's brothers, and Richard Grill's distant relative, who was probably a cousin, I haven't been able to see who he actually was, John Lundberg. Auntie Carrie was always there to boost morale in these difficult times with her tantalising treats. There are a few people in this story who have names in common. There are a couple of Johns, there are a couple of Christines as well, so I need to be careful as I differentiate between them. So John Lundberg had a wife called Evelyn. They had a daughter called Christina, who was married to a man called John Downey, so I'll refer to them as the Downeys from now. Auntie Carrie visited the newly widowed Evelyn several times, and the Downeys were also regular visitors to the Grills. On a few occasions after this, Evelyn and the Downeys became ill with inexplicable symptoms that lasted a week or two at a time, but then they seemed to dissipate. But there was no seeming explanation. They were thinking maybe it's something that they had all eaten together. They would feel tingling in their extremities, and hair would start to fall out quicker than it normally would. They'd experience pain, and Evelyn, over a period of time, actually went blind. One day in 1953, John Downey, so Evelyn's son-in-law, was reading the local paper and saw that one of the main articles talked about a 30-year-old woman called Yvonne Gladys Fletcher, who was on trial for murder. Yvonne Fletcher was accused of murdering her first husband, Desmond Butler, and her second husband, Bertrand Fletcher, by poisoning their food and drink over a long period of time. It wasn't until Yvonne's second husband died of eerily similar symptoms that her first husband had died from that she was first suspected. Her first husband, Desmond Butler, it was suspected he just died of natural causes, that there was no reason for it. But when her second husband became ill with exactly the same symptoms, that's when people thought, something's not right here. Yvonne's first husband's body was exhumed. Both men, both their bodies, were found to have been poisoned using the same substance. Thallium sulfate. Thallium sulfate was the active ingredient in a commonly used rat poison called thaurat. Thallium is odorless, colourless, and tasteless. Thallium was actually banned in most places in Australia, but not in Sydney, because the rat problem was so bad that thallium was being sold everywhere. It was ubiquitous, as ubiquitous as the rats themselves. Everybody had something like that on their shelves. People needed to keep rat poison nearby because there were so many of them. It was so widely used that the possibility of accidental human poisonings was not unheard of, and it was just as poisonous to people as it was to rats. Yvonne Fletcher was found guilty of the murder of both of her husbands and was sentenced to death. At first, John Downey was just interested in the story, but then the article went down to describe the symptoms that these two poor men experienced just before they died. Nerve pain and nerve damage, weakness in the muscles, blindness, alopecia, vomiting, confusion, and breathing problems. These symptoms were not only familiar, but they were identical to the symptoms that he, his wife, and his mother-in-law had been experiencing for weeks on and off. He strongly suspected that they were being poisoned by thallium, and it was certainly not by accident. Then, the penny dropped. There was a common denominator in all of these illnesses: Auntie Carrie. He realized that the sicknesses were caused when Auntie Carrie came over, and they would dissipate, they would go after Auntie Carrie had left or a few weeks after, but they always coincided with a visit from Auntie Carrie or when they visited her. John Downey went to the police with his suspicions, and he was told next time he was in Auntie Carrie's company to be extremely vigilant, to watch her like a hawk. And that's exactly what he did. He was able to collect several pieces of food. He didn't see anything particularly suspicious at first. He collected several samples, took them to the police, but none of them tested positive for thallium. The police said to him, "Don't give up, keep watching, because it's unlikely that she's doing this every time, because if she is, then people would have been dead already. This is a very slow process." So John kept on watching Auntie Carrie. Potentially, Auntie Carrie would more likely lace individual cups of tea or individual treats with thallium rather than the communal pot of tea, because of course she would drink from it too, and she would probably eat the biscuits and eat the cakes and everything. So there was a moment that John was waiting for to see when the thallium would be added to whichever person's teacup or treat that they would have. Then one day he, Christine and Evelyn went to see Auntie Carrie. He was watching her with a cup, and this cup of tea was to be for Evelyn. John saw Auntie Carrie quickly put her hand into the pocket of her dress, take out something small that he couldn't quite see, it was concealed with her hand, pass it swiftly over the teacup before setting it down in front of Evelyn. John picked up the teacup and said that he would top the cup up for Evelyn, because apparently it wasn't really that full anyway. So he took the tea out to the kitchen. John poured the tea into a jar and then made Evelyn a fresh cup, and he took the suspicious tea to the police. The tea tested positive for a lethal dose of thallium. If Evelyn had consumed this probably would have been the final dose that killed her. Auntie Carrie was arrested for the 3 attempted murders of Evelyn, her daughter, and her son-in-law. All 3 people were subjected to tests. I don't know what tests they would have done, like hair or urine, but they all showed signs of thallium, and thallium accumulates in the body. It doesn't go away very quickly at all. So they all had thallium in their systems. They were being poisoned slowly over a period of time. The police also speculated that Auntie Carrie had not only tried to murder these 3, but she had also murdered 4 members of her family. Christine Mickelson, her stepmother, Mary Ann Mickelson, her sister-in-law, and on her husband's side, Angelina Thomas and John Lundberg. 2 of the 4 had been cremated, the other 2 had been buried. The 2 that had been buried were exhumed, and their bodies tested positive for thallium. However, due to the lack of evidence that it was definitely Auntie Carrie that had caused these people to die from thallium poisoning, they couldn't actually charge her with murder. They instead just charged her for the 3 attempted murders. Some sources have said that she was charged with only the attempted murder of Evelyn because of the tea that she was going to give her then, and some say that it was for all 3 of them. But either way, she was charged with attempted murder. It could never be truly, positively, 100% confirmed that Auntie Carrie definitely had a hand in the passing of these 4 people, but they all had the same symptoms, and 2 definitely were poisoned with thallium. There is the remote possibility that it was accidental. Accidental poisonings would have happened in a place where thallium was just as, widely used as washing up liquid, but they couldn't bring the charges. It wasn't enough, but there was a strong case for attempted murder. Caroline Grills was tried at the Central Criminal Court in New South Wales. Her behaviour caused alarm in the court. She would have bouts of laughter, just laughing for no reason. She was smiling and waving at the jury. She was making inappropriate and random comments. She said something like, "Oh, it's such fun," or "what a load of fun," when she was outside talking to the press. And when she was actually arrested, she said something to the police that was odd. She said, "Oh, fancy that." So her behaviour was very strange, but at the same time she protested her innocence throughout with not even a serious or sincere tone. She showed no remorse, no regard at all. On the 15th of October in 1953, the jury just took 12 minutes to find Caroline Grills guilty of attempted murder. She was sentenced to death. However, when she appealed her sentence, rather than winning her appeal, it instead meant that her sentence was reduced from death and then commuted to life in prison. On hearing the verdict though, Caroline declared, "I helped to live, not to kill." Yeah. Caroline Grills was detained at the Long Bay State Reformatory for Women, where she was affectionately given the nickname Auntie Thally. So she went from being Auntie Carrie to Auntie Thally. She was actually popular with inmates, seen as a mother or auntie figure. On the 6th of October in 1960, Caroline Grills died from peritonitis caused by a ruptured ulcer. At this point, she'd also become a great-grandmother, so she had quite a huge family herself. She never admitted guilt, she never showed any remorse, she never explained what she did. Although 2 of these deaths were clearly for gain, that of the stepmother and Angelina Thomas, Caroline Grills had absolutely nothing to gain by the other 2 deaths, Mary Mickelson and John Lumberg. It's not clear exactly why she did that, because she had nothing to gain. There was nothing left in a will or anything like that. Maybe she was hoping there would be. But many think that she killed simply because she enjoyed it. She got a taste for it. She loved the feeling of having control over people's lives. She kind of found her calling. She probably thought it was baking and then decided it was a fusion of baking and death. The senior Crown prosecutor, Mick Rooney QC, alleged that she was, quote, "a killer who poisoned for sport, for fun, for the kick she got out of it, for the hell of it, for the thrill that she and she alone in the world knew the cause of the victim's suffering," end quote. Shortly after Caroline's conviction, another woman from Sydney was accused of attempted murder using thallium. Veronica Monty was accused of poisoning her son-in-law, Bob Lulham, which made him very ill, but he did not die. Veronica successfully convinced the jury that the poisoning was purely accidental, and she was found not guilty, but at one point, Veronica, Caroline Grills and Yvonne Fletcher were all at the state reformatory together at the same time. Veronica was acquitted, she was set free, and of course I said Caroline Grills, she actually died only after 6.5 years in prison. Yvonne Fletcher's sentence was also commuted to life in prison. In 1964, she was released after serving 12 years, and she died in 2009 after 45 years as a free woman. Not long after these 3 women were tried, some other people throughout Sydney had been treated for thallium poisoning, whether it was accidental, and some were found to have been poisoned on purpose. And there were suspected that there were many other deaths from thallium that had gone undiagnosed and unknown even way before Yvonne Fletcher's case was brought to light. It's very likely that the publicity from what these women did spawned people to try this method, to try to bump people off. But after a public outcry, thallium was banned, and it is banned in most places in the world now. That's because it's absolutely lethal. It used to be used in things like ant poisons, for example, and in pesticides. And it's not just because of the murder, but there could be unintentional poisonings. Because it was so widely used, the possibility that even a kid could get hold of it, and because it was odorless and tasteless, they wouldn't know from the taste that it's a hazardous substance. So I'm actually pleased that it was banned. I don't know what they used after that to get rid of the rats, but yeah, I think after Yvonne Fletcher's trial, that's when it should have been banned immediately. There was actually quite a recent case, now when I say recent, this was in the 1980s, of a woman called Peggy Carr of Alturas, Florida, who was murdered by her neighbor, George Treppel, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. He worked in a laboratory which used, I believe it was to manufacture amphetamines, And a byproduct of that was thallium. He got hold of this thallium and he poisoned some bottles of Coca-Cola. And Peggy and a few members of her family became very ill with thallium poisoning. But before it was found as to what thallium, that it was thallium, Peggy unfortunately passed away. Her death was slow and agonizing, but she had such a huge amount of poisoning to her body in a short space of time that there's nothing that the doctors could do. Peggy's slow and agonizing death actually occurred on the 15th of October in 1988, which was 35 years to the day after Caroline Grill's conviction. George Trappal was sentenced to death on the 6th of March 1991, and he still remains on death row in Florida. Anyway, that is this case today, so thank you very much for watching. If you have made it so far, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. I'd be grateful if you could please share this with everybody, tell people about this channel, get it out there. I'm not far at all from the 1,000 subscribers. Last time I checked today, I was on 789. If I can get that 211, I'll be so happy. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you have a case suggestion, please leave it in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter. I have a Facebook group as well. So I will see you in the next video, which will be a bit different. So still true crime, but a different format, a different tack. So I hope you are all well. See you later, little berries. Bye.